So you started out in journalism.
I did well in natural resources and the journalism minor, but I worked for the DNR, and it did start out as a technical assistance program, but it was in the era where there was an environmental bond passed, which required support in the form of grants and low-interest loans for communities for recycling and alternatives to landfill. So I moved into that arena, and we had grants for public, private sector support for these projects. So that was my first exposure with grant programs. From there, I did a few consulting jobs. I worked for state government for 11 years, and then ended up working in grants here. And it seems like when you're a grant maker, and you work in grant administration, we come from all backgrounds, and it's really a different set of skills that you learn through communications. You need to work with budgets, so you need to work with the accounting side of things to some degree. So a lot of it is acquired skill as you get into the programs.
The Humanities Council is a 501c3, I assume.
It is, yeah.
And that means that it has the ability to grant grants to others. And what is your mission, and what are you trying to accomplish with your grants? Tell me a little bit about the Humanities Council.
We have 4 different grant programs and 3 different funders, and the grants are mainly to support humanities programs in communities at the grassroots level. It's public humanities, so we do work with universities and academics, but the idea is to bring these opportunities to the public and also to underserved communities. So we have grants that support the programming primarily in a number of different ways. We work with the National Endowment for the Humanities is our primary funder. We also implement a program for the state council, the state arts Council for Arts and Environment. I'm sorry, Council for Arts and Humanities, and that is actually our humanities touring program, where we pass through the funding for the grants for that. We also have recently had a program supported through the William K. Kellogg Foundation, and that's a major program for bringing opportunities to share the stories of Michigan heritage, and it's under the Racial Equity Initiative of Kellogg. So we've been it's telling the history of all Michigan's people.
The humanities are an interesting area. When we think of it, it's sort of built on the university model of teaching humanities, it seems to me. And you have a mission, and then you have annual programs that fit that mission. Mm-hmm. Is that how you develop your grants each year? Some are fairly repetitive, but some are new initiatives that change over time. How does that history work?
The programs are based on the mission and goals of the organization. We do work with a board of directors that has a program committee and as well as a grants committee. So we adapt as things change. The council's been giving grants for 40 years, so in some form or another. So things have changed over that time, and now we do find maybe the methods of the programs, that what they involve, are a lot different. There's so much more digital humanities involved. In the past, it was all either a written form or we do support community discussions, but in disseminating the information in a broader sense, we do fund portals, information portals, web-based projects, a lot more of that now. So the programs support the goals, basically, which is to bring quality cultural programs into the Michigan communities, available to all residents on an equal basis, and we do that, but we're doing it in a little different ways, I think, as the years have gone on.
So each year you would issue an RFP, a request for proposals, and that would spell out what applicants have to do, a timetable, and the priorities, and how they should put their proposals together.
Right. We have an online applications, and we do announce the grant periods open and close depending on, there's 4 different grants and they have different cycles. So when the grant period opens, we offer a draft stage first, and we have a form, so that gives feedback to the applicants on what we know the review panels. We have an external panel for some of our grants. We know what they're going to be looking for, and we can help an applicant strengthen those areas before they submit the full application. But they would go online. We have the online forms and the guidelines and the resources, and they would prepare their application, submit by a deadline, and then the cycle begins where we have an external committee and the awards are made, and then the implementation follows.
What is the range of funding amounts for a typical grant through your organization?
It depends on the program. We have our major grants, major humanities grants, are up to $15,000. We do see a lot of them come in at the maximum request. But our heritage grants funded through the Kellogg Foundation are a little bit bigger. Those are $25,000. And then we have small grants called quick grants and planning grants that are $500 for a quick grant, $1,000 for a planning. And these are just the short, they may be a one-day program, they may bring in some speakers or some support people, so they're smaller and shorter time frames. Our other grants are basically a year-long, up to a year-long grant. And I should add that our foundation funding, our heritage grants do not require match, but our other programs do. So that's an important consideration, cash and in-kind support of a project that's going to match the grant request.
Now, do your applicants all have to be either an educational institution that would automatically qualify as nonprofit or as a 501c3?
And that's program dependent as well.
Okay.
Our funding through the National Endowment for the Humanities is federal funding. They do not require the 501c3, but a nonprofit in the state of Michigan is required. They must provide documentation for that. The Kellogg-based funding does require the 501c3 as the applicant. Because we're trying to reach smaller communities and smaller applicants, they may not be, but we do encourage collaboration. They may collaborate with a larger 501c3, but the authentic voice in that case needs to be the group that is the identity group for those particular racial equity grants.
There is some confusion, I think, on the part of people in the general community. They confuse nonprofit with 501c3 and think it's the same thing. The 501c3 is the federal IRS designation. That's a separate process, but you can get for a relatively small amount, you can become a nonprofit in the state of Michigan.
Right, yeah.
So that's an important thing for the applicants to know.
It is, and a lot of people will ask, well, what do I need to do? And there are some things, to be a nonprofit, they do have to have a board of directors, and there's some requirements that they find out through the state of Michigan. The 501c3 is really an IRS classification, and there's a lot more to be done to get that. So if a grant program requires you to be a 501c3, you need to allow some time for that process or find a partner.
What is the typical turnaround time between when you issue an RFP and when the person or the organization has to have completed its final application?
We start our draft review process generally maybe 3 or 4 months before the final deadline, but we do make the applications and the materials available view only online. So somebody at any time can go and look at what is required in the application and start to prepare their materials. But then we have a certain date, generally 3 or 4 months before the deadline, that we'll start taking the drafts, because we have to mesh our cycle with our other grant programs, make sure we don't have everything at once. So we'll take the drafts, we turn those around as quickly as we can, usually within a couple of weeks, just to give some general feedback, and then the applicants can take those comments and work on their final one. It's interesting that we get probably the vast majority, probably 90% of our applications come in on the last day or the day before. And so we always ask people to please allow time, and we would prefer to have it spread out a bit. If there was a problem in the system or anything, you really waiting to the last day is not the best idea, but I guess that's human nature.
How many grants does your organization grant during a typical year?
During a typical year, we have our major humanities grants between 25 and 30. I have another 30 or so quick grants. And then this year we have the new program, the heritage grants, which will again be between 25 and 30. So I guess that adds up to close to 100, between 90 and 100 grants of some kind. Our touring program, which is with the Council on Arts and Cultural Affairs, we have about 100 of those touring grants as well. So there's a lot of grant administration happening.
What is I think the thing that many of my students would like to know is, what are the typical mistakes that first-time grant writers make?
Mistakes? Well, probably, the one thing that I tell people in our grant workshops is that it's very important to just simply answer the questions. The questions are being asked for a reason, because they will correspond to the criteria that the grant will be evaluated based on. So, that's very important. Don't write around the question, just answer it directly, because the reviewers will appreciate that if they're scoring the application and they'll find that in the rubric and give the points. So answer them directly. One mistake I think, it's not in the application itself, but maybe it's prior to applying. It's very important to call and talk with the grants officer or the program officer at any level. And we're friendly usually. We're human. And it really, you can first run an idea past this person and make sure you fit the project. We get applications that really are not geared towards our goals and our mission, and it's not good to try to force your project into the goals and mission. Start with a program that really is for your project. And talking to this person, I've done it too, because I also write grants for the council, and I've talked to federal program officers, and they'll say, that's not really going to fit, or the timeline might not fit, and you don't want to invest your time, barking up the wrong tree. So talk to that person, either email or contact. And I think another tip would be to make sure, as you look through all the guidelines, that you can meet the timeline, you can meet the requirements for match, if there are any. So kind of do a lot of research before you apply.
It seems to me one of the challenges for universities often is the fact that they find it difficult in some cases to field people during summer, and many of the grant cycles really require, the university cycle may not fit the grant cycle.
Yeah.
And so the question becomes, how do you adjust for that?
Yeah. It's a little hard. We do offer a 90-day pre-award period, which sometimes helps if, in terms of the project, if the project is proposed. And for instance, we're doing some grant workshops now in the summer with universities, and so they can get their information before they break, and then work on it over the summer. Our application deadline is actually early September, which may not, if there's, it could be difficult for that program. We do have another program that operates in the spring, and actually the awards are made in the spring, so that might fit better with universities. So planning ahead, or even if it's possible to plan for the succeeding year, is one thing we've talked about. But sometimes, there are just some timelines that just simply don't fit, and you have to work around it in whatever way you can.
When you talk about your review panels, how are they made up? How do you find people? Who are they comprised of? And what kinds of leeway do they have?
Sure. Our review panels for our NEH funded grants are required to have primarily our board members. We have a 25-member board, and my grant review committee will consist of anywhere between, I think I have 9 now, I've had up to a dozen people. We do pull in peer reviewers sometimes if we need them, and these are people who have asked to be part of the process. A lot of times they are retired or current university people who want the experience of reviewing grants, because they may then be writing grants. and if you have an opportunity to be a peer reviewer, it's a very good training situation if you're going to be writing grants, because you see what happens during the review process. But ours we have to separate into 2 panels because of the volume we receive. So we'll have a combination of board members, and if we do have outside reviewers or peer reviewers, then we'll add them in the mix, but it is the majority are board members.
And how long they read your panels, then read the proposals, and they give you feedback? Do they have the final determination, or does your board then vote on? How does that process work?
Well, they do. They read the proposals. We give them the scoring rubric after we do the administrative review. So anything that's not eligible is weeded out. They receive and they go read the entire application, all the attachments, and they come to an in-person meeting with their scores, and they discuss each application. And then they have a final score that they turn in, and that group then, depending on the amount of dollars available, will fund up to that maximum. And those recommendations are made to either our executive committee or our full board. So once the board approves the awards, then they can be public, and that's the final step for us.
And then the cycle starts all over again.
And then we work on implementation, right? And we get everything going, and then we start again with the new projects.
Does your organization, how if I am an organization putting together a grant proposal and I want to have multiple funders because the limits on what you can give don't get us quite where we need to go, but we think we might have corporate giving in the community or some other component. How do those, do you work with organizations that have those issues, and how does that work in your system?
We do. Well, we'll ask for. I mean, when they do the proposal, we have the matching requirements. So we'll be indicating where the other cash is coming from, if there is other cash, or it could be in kind in our case. So we do look at things like contributed materials that maybe it's not actually cash funding, but it's a contribution, or it's time. A value is put on a volunteer's time. And that kind of thing. So there's a whole really funding strategy to each proposal, and we do have indications sometimes if another source of funding is pending, and if we're funding something that has another funder that's pending, we don't know if they actually have that piece. They still have to indicate before the award and before a grant agreement is signed that everything is in place. There can be conditions on the grant. When the panel comes through the process, if they're not comfortable with something, or if there's something that they think needs to really be in place, this can be added as a condition, so that might be handled that way.
One of the trends that I've seen in funding over the years, is particularly at the university level, is that they are now, it used to be that the silo alone applied, the specific department, and now I'm seeing more cross-departmental collaborations.
Yeah.
Is that a trend that you're seeing in grant writing, in the grants that applications you're seeing?
We do, and it's actually a good thing. I think, for instance, we may have a communications-based component to a grant that actually might have been submitted or might have been part of a science-based initiative. Because they too, I believe, if you're applying to the National Institute of Science, or whatever the technical term is, they would require a community outreach component, and so the humanities are an excellent way of communicating about an issue that affects society in either a scientific way, or maybe medical, it may be environmental, but there's always a role for humanities. So we do see projects that combine departments, combine focuses, and we like to see collaboration of all sorts.
So universities, researchers who are looking at National Institutes of Health, which is certainly the primary funder that many are concerned with, it is compatible and collaborative with humanities grants.
Yes, and that's what we've been seeing more nationally, actually, and the trends I've been seeing is that there will be, those kinds of grants that then must bring the outreach and the communications component out. What humanities may fund is a community discussion around an issue that affects society in many ways, anything that really affects us as humans. So it could be a topic related to health, and then the humanities portion of that project, and a grant could be applied to implement maybe community discussions around the state, or something that involves sharing what's learned in that.
Can you tell me one or two projects that you funded in recent years that you think were particularly successful in meeting their?
Well, we have a real diverse group of projects that cover all kinds of things. We've had some very successful exhibits. We do work with museums quite a bit, and if a museum is doing an exhibit that may be in a broader sense, I think one of my favorites happened at the Muskegon Museum of Art, which may not have been a typical place we'd be looking at, because we do work with not so much in the arts area, but we work in the humanities. But they were having an exhibit come in that dealt with the Depression era and the public works movement, and they had the paintings of people who painted during that time to depict that era, and they tied in programming about what happened in Muskegon with all of the public works projects, the buildings that were built because of it, the stories of people who were lived through that and remembered what the history and the cultural implications of that time. So they took the art, but they built the humanities and the story into it. And I think probably the best projects we have are always those that tell a story of some kind. because there's just a tremendous amount of stories in Michigan. We do a lot of projects that involve Native American history, and there's, story and telling the history verbally, oral histories are really compelling too.
Any last minute advice that you would like to give to our graduate students about what they need to know to be successful in grant writing?
I would think too, as you develop a narrative, the narrative is very important, and we talked about being clear, answering the questions, but you also have to explain who you are or who your organization is. And I think what I've seen with review committees, and especially if they have people who are not from that particular field, it's always good to not assume they know who you are. And no matter how well known your organization is, you may have people who have never worked in that particular field. So explain who you are and why you are very qualified as an organization or as a project directors. The team is qualified, and explain that. Don't assume that they know that you are a very well-known organization and researcher or in your field.
And if you're not a good communicator, I propose that you get a good communicator to help you tell your story.
True, and it doesn't have to be a very flowery type writing. It has to be clear and to the point, and make that point so that somebody reading it is drawn into the rest of your story. You may have an abstract or a summary in the beginning, and that's very important too, because that makes them want to focus on certain points as they go through the rest of your application. Or it brings that to the point that's often used as a summary as they share applications or share grant information later that represents your project. So put a lot into your summary.
As a frequent grant reviewer, I can tell you that we learn in journalism, don't bury your lead.
Don't bury your lead. That's really.
Don't make me get to page 10 before I figure out what you're really doing.
Yes.
That's wonderful.